my objective today is to attempt a unifying theory that explains the grimly dystopian quality of our culture, especially over the past 2 years. Why are we being forced to mouth absurdities, such as the notion that Admiral Rachel Levine is a woman, and historical untruths, such as the claim that the American Revolution was fought mainly to preserve slavery? And why do these tendencies seem to go hand in hand with the never-ending medical tyranny of the COVID age? A fusion crystallized for me last year when the same epidemiologists who had prescribed even small outdoor worship gatherings insisted that public health also required participation in the George Floyd riots. Why is that? Now, one standard conservative explanation for these phenomena, critical race theory, cancel culture, wokeism, COVID tyranny, and so on, is that quote-unquote cultural Marxists or neo-Marxists or American Marxists or disciples of Herbert Marcuse have taken over our institutions and are using them to subvert all that we hold dear. The response, the thinking goes, should be a robust cultural pushback by a coalition of the sane. We are told, the courage to boldly reclaim the culture, to tell the truth about sex and gender and about our history. We need to reset the narrative, we are told, or to push the right values. But conservatives have been waging this kind of defensive culture war for a very long time, at least going back to the debates over political correctness, a term that has somewhat disappeared from our public life, in the 1980s and 90s. It hasn't worked, and I propose it won't work. You and I can shout that Abraham Lincoln wasn't a horrible racist until we all go blue in the face, and it won't do much to turn the cultural tide. Perhaps what's missing is a deeper analysis. We need to figure out whether today's dizzying developments really represent something new and revolutionary, or whether what we're dealing with is merely the acceleration of older and deeper processes of ideological transformation. And if the latter is the case, as I think it is, then we have to wonder at the material forces driving the cultural change, or at least cooperating with it. No, culture and social consciousness aren't simply reducible to economics, as a kind of vulgar Marxism would have it. But it's foolish to deny that all culture rests on a material substrate. And we can't begin to counter the forces that have assailed us without untangling these knots between culture and material reality. In other words, we need a material diagnosis. And to do that, I propose we visit a place called Eden-Olympia. Has anyone been there? Well, I don't blame you. Eden-Olympia is a fictional business park in the south of France, the setting for one of J.G. Ballard's last novels, Supercon, published in 1999. Our protagonists are Dr. Jane Sinclair, a British pediatrician hired to replace one of the park's physicians, and her husband, Paul, a pilot convalescing from a plane crash. Eden-Olympia recruits Jane because her predecessor, another Brit named Dr. David Greenwood, has gone postal, shooting up 10 colleagues, many of them senior executives at the park, before turning the gun on himself. And as Jane gets absorbed into her work, Eden-Olympia is a sort of playground for workaholics. It falls to the jobless Paul to unravel the mystery of Greenwood. Why would a gentle pediatrician go postal like that and murder innocents in cold blood? It's a magnificent novel, a potent mix of noir and science fiction. What matters for our purposes is Eden-Olympia itself, the business park, which is as much a character as Ballard's human characters. I'd like to focus on 3 of its characteristics and see if they sound uncannily familiar to you. The first feature of Eden-Olympia is an obsession with bodily health. It turns out that in addition to her routine duties, Jane is also expected to help Eden-Olympia create a park-wide medical diagnostic system. As she tells her husband, every morning when they get up, people will dial the clinic and log in their health data, pulse, blood pressure, weight, and so on. One prick of the finger on a small scanner, and computers will analyze everything: liver enzyme, cholesterol, prostate markers, and so on. Her boss, she goes on, is very keen on fecal smears, but I suspect that's one test too far. He just hates the idea of all that used toilet paper going to waste. The greatest diagnostic tool in the world literally flushed down the lavatory. Let's not give Dr. Fauci ideas. Later, we learn that Jane is running a new computer model that shows that if office workers sat further 18 inches apart, they could stop the disease vectors of respiratory viruses in their tracks. Ballard quite literally foresaw the social distancing regime before anyone had heard of the novel coronavirus. Although even with his dystopian prescience, he couldn't foresee the rise of universal permanent masking as a sort of medical hijab in the West. The second feature of Eden-Olympia is that it's a profoundly anti-political place, beginning with its name. Note that Sophia Antipolis is the name of an actual Silicon Valley-style business park in southern France that's mentioned in the novel. Sophia Antipolis is the ancient Greek name for nearby Antibes. Antipolis literally means opposite the city, that is, opposite the city of Nice. But the ancient name happens to be nicely evocative of what these business parks are like to Ballard's mind. They are anti-polises, anti-cities, the opposite of what the ancient city represented, the ideal of the city as a family of families, a political community, a space for cultivating civic virtue. Quote, an invisible infrastructure took the place of traditional civic virtues, Paul tells us. At Eden-Olympia, the top drawer professionals no longer needed to devote a moment's thought to each other and had dispensed with the checks and balances of community life. Again and again, Eden-Olympia's architects drive home this point. In a telling exchange, Paul tells one executive that, quote, there is no drama here, no conflict. There are no clubs or evening classes, no charities or church fetes, no fundraising galas, no police or legal system, no democratic accountability. No one votes. So who runs things? And the executive responds, we do. We run things. At Eden-Olympia, private power has swallowed the commons, eaten it from the inside out. Morality, if it can be called that, is baked into ergonomics. You don't debate great public issues or allow the ancient rivalry between classes to play out in a real political way. There are cameras everywhere and a private police force to respond to any abnormalities. Again, Ballard is prophetic here. For us, morality, insofar as it exists, is programmed into our smartphones. Things no longer get debated, but algorithms ensure that we're steered away from quote-unquote extremist content, the definition of which is ever shifting according to the needs of the system. If an inconvenient piece of information surfaces, for example, emails showing that the son of the regime's preferred presidential candidate had arranged meetings between his father and a Ukrainian energy firm paying the son $83,000 a month, nice work if you can get it, the story gets disappeared from the internet by faceless technologists. The state surveillance apparatus then frames the news as quote-unquote disinformation, and the corporate-owned press cheers the censorship. Only once the regime candidate's presidency is secure does the system authorize that same information for public consumption again. Truth is perfectly ductile to the contours of the regime's practical needs. It isn't that the executives at Eden-Olympia don't know that there is a dark side to the park, which we'll get to. They're perfectly aware, and they take what they consider sanitary steps to contain it. It isn't that the corporate media industrial complex in the United States is unaware that our illustrious presidential son traded on his last name to enrich himself and his family. They're perfectly aware, and they're prepared to take the necessary sanitary steps to clean up the public square. There is no public political culture, no institutions devoted to sustaining it at Eden-Olympia. Which brings us to the third and final feature. Eden-Olympia has no progeny and no past. Not long after they arrive, Jane and Paul cease conjugal relations. Jane works too hard, she has no time. And indeed, in the entire park, there are no children, none. One executive tells Paul, quote, today's corporate city is superbly talented, adult, and virtually childless, end quote. So much for progeny. As for the past, well, it simply doesn't exist. The executives at the park, you might expect, are quite diverse. This is a multicultural place. Its professional ranks are drawn from Britain, France, Mexico, Japan, and so on. But there's nothing particularly British or French or Mexican or Japanese about them. Rather, what unites them, as one critic of the park tells Paul, is that they're all, quote, paid-up members of the new elite. They're the corporate chosen people. As the park expands, it literally destroys the history, natural and man-made, of the surrounding community. And interestingly, Jane embraces this ahistorical quality. She hasn't thought about it that deeply, but somehow she understands that this ahistoricity is good for people like her, for their success. Eden-Olympia, she tells Paul, has a lot going for it. It's open to talent and hard work. There are no grounds already staked out, no title deeds going back to bloody Magna Carta. You feel anything could happen. So she's expressing the dream of total global meritocracy. Places that have deeds going back to bloody Magna Carta impose inherited obligations. They're messy, they're democratic, there are competing claims, there is memory, there are ancient authorities, there is a sense of nationhood. All this stands in the way of the global meritocrat. And where these messy competing claims arise, not least the claims of the poor, the small property holder, and so on, Eden-Olympia wages literal class war. I mentioned that the executives have a darker side. They go on these trips hunting parties they call ratissage, raking over, where they beat up local prostitutes, immigrants, and so forth, people who in one way or another stand in the way of the omnipresent car park. Nevertheless, despite the fact that I think Ballard makes one mistake, which is that the executives are far-right nationalists. They vote for the National Front. I think that's false. I think that in the real world versions of them would be Macronites through and through. But I still think he's right in the main in his analysis of class violence and war required to realize the professional managerial class's dream world. So to tie it all together to our present condition, I think we're living in a kind of Eden-Olympia writ large. Or rather, we are in a stage of transition, a shift between, on one hand, a vestigial world of still embodied communities inhabited by political animals with historical memories, and on the other, the nightmarish utopia of Eden-Olympia. The ideological paroxysms that so worry us are symptoms of this historical passage. So note the elements. 1, bodily obsession, social distancing, the dream of a world without grime, without the sweat and sense of other human beings. Of course, as Ballard reminds us, such a world serves the interests of some classes and not those of others. The laptop class generates value by manipulating information on screens, and it looks with bewilderment and contempt at two groups it views as vestigial: small property holders and what I have called tangible workers. What to do with them? Ideally, all that kind of labor and value generation would be automated, relegated to drones and online retailers and so on. But the intangibles class, or the laptop class, still needs tangible labor. Silicon Valley, as my friend and the author Michael Lind has pointed out, can't do all it does without massive storage and power generation facilities spread across the heartland and maintained by working class people, by tangible labor. Eden-Olympia needs farmers and restaurants and nannies and high-end escorts. Now, enter COVID-19, a real crisis to be sure, but also what a tremendous opportunity to squeeze the tangibles class, to discipline it, to transfer as much of its livelihood as possible to virtual realms controlled by the laptop class. An incredible opportunity for an upward transfer of wealth. And of course, the added benefit of social distancing, literally enacting distance between people and classes, a separation symbolized by the medical hijab and the plexiglass barrier. Why won't they let the virus go? Why won't they let us move on? Because class war is carried out in many ways. Depending on your job, your face mustn't be seen. Think about that. Depending on what kind of work you work, your face can't be seen in society. The general anti-political thrust of Eden-Olympia, again, that finds expression in big tech censorship, but also, I would argue, in woke language regulation. Conservatives detect behind the expansion of language policing and cancel culture the sinister hand of quote-unquote Marxist American scholars reared on exotic continental theories, and there is some truth to that. But this interpretation risks obscuring a larger and more important truth. Cancel culture is the new factory discipline. Much of what's called left today doesn't seek to empower workers. Rather, it mainly seeks after post-tax handouts as well as quote-unquote representation on corporate boards, in university curricula, and so on. And of course, the firing of those who say the wrong or awkward thing in the public square, in workplaces, in the classroom. The goal isn't to rectify concrete economic injustices, massive inequalities in wealth, health and job insecurity, and so on. Rather, it's the opposite: to mitigate, to defer, to smooth over, to mask substantive political disagreements, and instead have battles at the level of language and manners. By fortifying the requirements to speak and think correctly and raising the stakes for failure, the neoliberal class, as we can now call them, has built a repressive new mechanism for staying on top and keeping the oiks down. Finally, that ahistorical quality. Here again, the conservative diagnosis is wrong. If critical race theory and the desecration and destruction of historical memory really threatened the material interests of Jeff Bezos and Apple Corporation and Nike and the trustees of Ivy universities and so on, do you think they would ally themselves with these forces? Don't be naive. They would shut it down like that. And it isn't just the fact that wokesters trained by disciples of Judith Butler and Herbert Marcuse have somehow captured the corporate establishment, although that's certainly part of it. Again, the larger truth that risks being obscured is that the bringing about of Eden-Olympia demands ahistoricity. Because people who have historical memory have heroes, they have romantic ideals, they have authorities that guide their consciences, they have national pride. Family and community form the warp and weft of their characters. People who don't have such things make the perfect corporate subjects, be they the ones who occupy the commanding heights or those who toil on the peripheries. All this brings us to a conclusion. Conservatives' cultural counterpunch won't land a serious blow unless it's married to a material program aimed at checking the power of the social forces arrayed against us. We can't retreat into monastic redoubts and hope to be left alone. This kind of neoliberalism has global ambitions that very much extend to your small classical academy and to your chicken farm in the remote area. Nor is it much use to try to combat it with your right kind of consumer choice. Well, I won't use Google or I won't use Apple or Amazon until they stop censoring me. Consumer choice, even your dissenting choice, merely reproduces the logic of a consumer society, so your boutique dissident choices are already priced in. Nor, finally, will appeals to tolerance or intellectual diversity or debate or free speech avail much. These were the watchwords of the regime's protagonists, especially against the Catholic Church, when their movement was yet in its infancy. Now that they hold the whip hand, they have no use for these procedural niceties. They've achieved their substantive vision. This is our tolerance. This is our diversity. We run things. Therefore, a culture-first conservatism that would decry the woke toppling of our heroes while making it easier for Bezos and crew to benefit from labor, tax, regulatory, and tech arbitrage is a pathetic contradiction. It is bound to fail. It would, however, continue to generate think tank and magazine sinecures for the right people on the right. But that's small consolation for those of our fellow citizens whose way of life have been marked for demolition on the road to Eden-Olympia. Thank you very much.